Greetings, everyone. Peter Maravelis here on behalf of City Lights Booksellers and Publishers and the City Lights Foundation. I'd like to welcome you to another installment of City Lights Live, the virtual extension of our events calendar, where we continue to celebrate the works of authors we know and love through readings, discussions, and forums. Tonight, City Lights, in conjunction with Yale University Press, celebrate the publication of Manufacturing Consensus, Understanding Propaganda in the Era of Automation and Anonymity. It's by Sam Woolley. Manufacturing Consensus presents an in-depth exploration of social media and emergent technology that details the inner workings of modern propaganda. The book draws on 8 years of original research, drawing upon international ethnographic studies amongst people who actually build, combat, and experience these propaganda campaigns. Professor Woolley presents an extensive view of the evolution of computational propaganda, offering us a glimpse into the future and suggesting pragmatic responses for those on the forefront of promoting democratic principles. Before we begin, I would like to take this moment to acknowledge that we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral grounds of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. We'd like to take this moment to offer respect to those who have come before us as stewards of the land. Samuel Woolley is Assistant Professor of Journalism and Media, Program Director of the Propaganda Research Lab, and Knight Faculty Fellow at the Center for Media Engagement at the University of Texas at Austin. He is the author of The Reality Game: How the Next Wave of Technology Will Break the Truth. Joining him tonight in conversation is Jeff Horwitz. Jeff Horwitz is an award-winning technology reporter for the Wall Street Journal based in the Bay Area. His reporting has won repeated recognition. He's previously served as financial and enterprise reporter for the Associated Press in Washington, D.C., where his work earned him the Christopher J. Wells Memorial Prize from the Knight Bagehot Fellowship. Now, we're delighted to have both of you with us tonight. Before we begin, I would like to remind everyone we're going to be posting links in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard, with which you may purchase copies of Manufacturing Consensus, as well as Professor Woolley's previous book, The Reality Game. So we'll be featuring a Q&A towards the end of the evening, so please do post your questions, your comments in the chat function. So join us now in offering a warm welcome to Samuel Woolley and Jeff Horwitz. Gentlemen, welcome to City Lights. Such a pleasure.
All right, Sam, you're still with me?
I am, I'm here.
Okay, excellent. So yeah, let's start this off. I think I spoke with you in my first couple of months. You were out in Berkeley at the time. I spoke with you in my first couple of months covering Facebook. And I think my question boiled down to something bots, Russians, bad things, internet. And, we talked back then. This is in 2019, and I was perhaps a little green. But I guess I'd love to hear about how you got, first of all, your entrance into bot-related reporting, as this has become something of a career, and also sort of where you came to this book from that you had not covered in previous material.
Sure. So the story of this goes way back to 2013, when I was a PhD student at the University of Washington out in Seattle. And I was working with a professor there by the name of Phil Howard, who's now at Oxford. And Phil and I were talking about the ways in which we saw social media and the internet being used for democratic purposes during the Arab Spring. And something kept coming up, which was that there was a lot of spam surrounding those conversations. There was a lot of garbage on Twitter and Facebook and YouTube. And not only that, but some of it seemed to be coordinated. Some of it seemed to be oriented towards attacking and harassing activists and journalists who were trying to cover the event. And a lot of it seemed to be automated, bluntly. And so we wanted to study that. And we came up with this idea that we called at the time computational propaganda. We said, what happens when you automate propaganda? What happens when you amplify this stuff? And so for the last 10 years or so, I've been working to study exactly that question. What happens when you massively amplify and suppress through computational means the ability to propagandize? And over the course of time, it's revolutionized my thinking about what it means to spread propaganda and by association, things like disinformation and coordinated harassment and trolling and all of these sorts of things. And along the way, it's led me to to a lot of traveling, looking at the ways in which state actors do this stuff, but also the ways in which regular people are able to leverage bots, and also a lot of other tools these days in order to amplify their own their own political agenda. And so that's where we are now. And what's in this book, I think that's not in other books, is the 8 years of field work that I've done in various countries, talking to the people who make and build propaganda online, and also to the folks that track it and work to combat it as well.
So on the people who build and make it, I don't know. I've probably spent more time with the latter camp, right? People who are concerned about this stuff than with the people who are like, this is awesome. I guess I'd be curious if there is like any sense that this is shameful or or untoward, or that, I mean, do they consider themselves to be duplicitous, or is this just kind of what you do if you want to have impact?
Yeah, broadly speaking, you can split these folks into two camps. On the one hand, you have people that very much buy into the politics and very much buy into the ideology of leveraging and of a given movement. And so they believe that leveraging the internet to amplify that content is just another way of getting the message out there. And so, yeah, even those folks sometimes will admit that what they're doing is duplicitous or underhanded, but many times they like to brag about what they do, and they think of themselves as gaming the system for the benefit of their political cause. The other camp is people that do this to make money. There's a lot of riches to be made on the internet if you can figure out how to get clicks, if you can figure out how to game Google AdSense, if you can figure out how to get a lot of YouTube viewers, or if you can figure out how to rent botnets or other kinds of services that allow others to amplify their content online. And so those folks are, they also do a lot of bragging. There's some symmetry there, because both of these kinds of people, they feel like they're kind of a leg up on other people online. They feel like they've hacked the system. In many ways, what they do is quite rudimentary. Some of these people are more sophisticated than others, but most of the time, they're not doing anything that amazing. But yeah, it runs the gamut. I think about, like, in India, you have these folks called BJP. The BJP party has these folks called IT Yodas. Yoda meaning Sanskrit, or meaning warrior in Sanskrit. And they are diehard fans of Narendra Modi, the prime minister there. And they do not think that having 1,000 or 2,000 racked cell phones to log on to WhatsApp and post messages is a bad thing. They think it's fantastic. Not only that, they think that we're getting around WhatsApp's forwarding limits, and so we can do things for Modi that no one else can. And we've really figured something out.
I think you've been talking to some of the same people I have, because they might have shown a particular tech company racks of phones very proudly at one point.
They did, yes.
I don't know if you've seen that, but I have some familiarity with those details, so that's funny to hear.
It's
I
really
too
funny.
am writing a book, Sam. No, but
No. It's funny you mentioned that, Jeff, because the way I found out about it is that someone at a particular tech company mentioned to me they'd seen a bunch of racked phones in India, and they're like, hey, you should contact these guys. And so I weirdly got put in contact with them through a social media company. So anyway.
Oh, you got in touch with them. That's awesome. Okay.
Yeah. I talked to them.
So this is material that I have not spoken directly to the source. Okay. So I guess a question for you is, like, first, like, you mentioned the sophistication of this, that it's candidly not that, you don't have to be a genius to do it. And I did notice that unemployed appeared to be one of the key descriptors, professional descriptors of people that you spoke to. And so I guess the question I would have is, like, the level of sophistication for this versus the level of impact is something I'd be curious about.
I think that the most well-resourced actors, so state governments, the intelligence community, militaries, corporations, et cetera, are the ones who can scale their operations the most and arguably have the most impact. The folks that are, by themselves, that are trying to build botnets on their own, do this, have markedly less impact. Although there are people that hit the sweet spot. There are people that I interviewed for this book and that I spoke to that are former computer engineers who are retired, who do this as a hobby, and who are very good at doing it, and had a special luck prior to 2016, but even now have luck. The landscape is shifting. It's shifting away from fully automated campaigns and towards more semi-automated campaigns and the use of influencers and other stuff. But yeah, propaganda, as I say tongue-in-cheek in the book, has been democratized in a lot of ways, in the same ways that journalism, and anyone can quote unquote be a journalist on Instagram or break a story. At least anyone can be a propagandist online, but someone at the Wall Street Journal is going to have a lot more resources than someone who's just doing it for fun now and then. Hopefully.
Hopefully we are not engaging in propaganda, but we get
Oh no,
get questions about that from time to time. No, I guess so. A question is, do you have a sense of sort of the difficulty in making this stuff seem novel? And because I think you noted that in 2012, 2013, when you're looking at Arab Spring stuff, it looked like crap, right? It's like some people were just like spamming random stuff at a hashtag. Like it's obvious that this is not, human behavior. Has that really evolved, or is it just like basically an arms race of amplifying crap for the most part? I mean, you mentioned that we're getting into sort of a more semi-automated thing, and so I'd be curious about that.
Yeah, it's a means and ends game. So if you think about this in terms of like a taxonomy of methods or tools, like there's people who still use spam, deliberately use spam in ways that might seem like just total garbage to us, but that are still able to achieve what they want, which is blocking conversations through like the co-option of hashtags or just flooding certain kinds of discussions with nonsense. And that's an age-old tactic that some people on Twitter used to call Twitter bombing, but that still happens today. Elon Musk is very fond, for instance, of crypto bots and the ways in which those play a role on making Twitter junky. And then there are people that run the gamut all the way up to very sophisticated folks who are leveraging some degree of machine learning or AI to build bots that, while they're not true AI chatbots, like some of the stuff we see coming out now, arguably, they are able to engage in more sophisticated conversation. They're mostly successful at getting people who aren't digital natives to be tricked. So people in developing countries, people who are older. Simultaneously, there is a lot of use of humans, coordinated groups of humans, and coordinated groups of influencers, celebrity influencers, and also small scale ones. And those folks are much better at doing the conversation stuff. I think the bots and a lot of the automated tactics, what the folks argue is that they're better at gaming the algorithms. So it's more of a computer to computer conversation.
I guess I have in my reporting come across allegations that in certain countries, in particular, in the Middle East, there have been efforts to affect not just what's trending, but also just what recommendation systems end up promoting more broadly, right? Like, so what, basically just engagement to propel things out to a very wide audience. And I guess I'm curious about how robust you think platforms have been, if there's anyone that stands out as being reasonably good at this in terms of blocking it, or if, I have 50 people and they have some big, slightly spammy accounts, whatever I'm saying is going to go, big.
Yeah, the major platforms have made progress on this, but most of them are still pretty bad. Twitter was getting better. Twitter was becoming kind of a best in class. It's a dubious distinction given that there was still a lot of issues, particularly in non-English instances. But in order to really game recommendations and game trending algorithms across Twitter for the last couple of years, you had to be very sophisticated. You had to be pretty good at organizing mostly human actors and to some degree, some bots to support those humans. Facebook and YouTube are, come next, and Facebook's made some headway here, but I think where we see more manipulation is less in the algorithmic sense and more in the Facebook group sense. That's where people are able to spread propaganda more effectively, because that's where you talk to people you don't know on Facebook. And then, there's some other platforms that do really good and some that do really bad. So Pinterest has taken a really hard approach to basically saying, we're not going to allow XYZ sorts of content, including, say, for instance, anti-vaccine content. And they've taken a really hard line. But then you also have all of the clones of other social media sites that quote unquote claim to be free speech. Platforms like Gab and Rumble and those kinds of ones. And it's the Wild West on those platforms.
It occurs to me that there is an incentive for platforms to suggest that they have this problem under control. And by that, I'm talking about computational propaganda more broadly, right? So if you have, a group of people that are just like, say, sharing 200 comments an hour on posts, they're going to win the game, right? And it occurs to me that it's in the interest of platforms to define this problem very narrowly. Like the techniques, the actors, and the harm. And because otherwise it seems like you start having to think about things like, should tighter rate limits be imposed on, IP addresses, or, should you be able to leave 200 comments per hour, right? And I would be curious if you get the sense that there has been an overstatement of capacity. In the book, there is a company that sure sounds a lot like Facebook that you more or less suggest has been perhaps pushing the bounds of what it can credibly claim its accomplishments are. And I mean, if I look at Meta's announcements related to inauthentic behavior, the networks just keep getting smaller and smaller every year. And candidly, the things they do bust, they look really lame. Like even the US run bot thing that was, Twitter and Meta busted, last year, super lame, accomplished nothing. And so I'd be curious to get your sense of if they're effective and why those numbers seem to be so non-concerning from the large platforms these days.
Yeah, there's some misdirection going on there, and you're absolutely right to point out that it's misdirection that benefits the platforms. There's, without a shadow of a doubt, the platforms, most of them, all of them overstate what they're able to actually effectively do. In my last book, I talked about Zuckerberg's hearings before Congress and how many times he mentioned AI as the solution to the problems that were being faced after the 2016 election. And it was like, in that book, I said, AI was like Zuckerberg's MacGuffin. It was like it filled in everything for him. It filled in every plot line, and that's still to this day pretty kind of the case. What I think is happening is that the platforms, we've started to look to the platforms for information on what's happening, where we've kind of begun to rely on them as if they're somehow trustworthy. It's kind of the same as looking at a crooked police department and letting them tell you which cops are bad and which cops are good. And I think that's kind of an asinine proposal. There's no true oversight of these companies. There's no, there's the Facebook Oversight Board, which, it
has a name that's a little unfortunate given the limits of
Exactly. I don't even want to get started on that, but across all of these companies, there's still a marked lack of access to data for third-party researchers. There's still a constant battle going on for us to get more access. And in fact, we're not getting more access over the course of time. We're getting less access. So CrowdTangle is effectively closed off to researchers now. Elon Musk has purchased Twitter, and now no one really knows what's going to happen there. And so, relying upon the social media companies for information on what's going on is a non-starter for me. Have they made some progress? Yes, they're actually talking about this stuff. They're taking it a bit more seriously. But as I said to you when we had a chat a little earlier, a lot of folks that I know at Facebook and Meta who have worked specifically on this topic and mitigation of this kind of content have been fired in recent months. Many of them, and all of them that I knew at Twitter have been fired, except for people in policy positions whose job it is to make everything look okay.
Yeah, that's they've lost some good people. I acknowledge that. We should talk more about those people at some point.
Yeah, we should. We should.
No, but I guess, and this is just sort of a question more broadly about sort of where bots fit in. I mean, I think when you and I first met, I was just sort of settling into this beat, and it was still kind of the tail end of the Russia and Cambridge Analytica stuff, given that ran for like 2 years. I think there was a sense of like, there was a sense that it had to be bots because normal people just didn't behave like this online. And I think, something that in my work, in the Facebook files stuff, that seems like is that sometimes telling the difference between an automated campaign and, someone who thinks that, like, quite literally Hillary Clinton is being kept alive from adrenochrome harvested in the basement of a non-existent basement of a pizza parlor, like, they act fairly similar. And I guess I'm curious about sort of how you see bots interacting with kind of the amplification systems of the platforms, because I think about something like Facebook groups. You can invite, I believe the number was at least previously north of 1,000 users per day. There was, I think we cited this in the Facebook files reporting, like there was a single user that invited 400,000 people to QAnon groups. And I guess my question is, like, is that in the end pretty much the same thing in terms of effect? And does it make a difference? Or is, yeah.
Yeah, these are really great points. And I mean, it's very similar to what bots do in some senses. So there are hyperactive users on social media, and as we talked about earlier, there's people that post about a given topic on a given group page 100 times in an hour, was I think the number you mentioned, and I've definitely seen that, if not even more. And so quantity alone, a bot can certainly outstrip a human. They'll get caught very quickly based upon timestamps and the amount they're posting. So if you try to post 1,000 times in an hour or 2,000 times in an hour, that's just clearly automated behavior. What bots can do that humans can't is coordinate computationally. So there's more network coordination. There's more ability to hone into particular topics based upon trends, based upon those sorts of things. And so what we effectively see is, like, the computational enhancement of propaganda in those cases. But one thing I always try to say to people, and I probably said this to you many times, Jeff, is there's always a person behind a bot, right? A bot is only a tool, and a group of bots are only a tool that are as good as the person that's shepherding them.
And the platform that they're operating on.
Yeah, exactly. And so propagandists are, my friend Tim Huang likes to say, propagandists are pragmatists. They will use the best tool and the cheapest tool and the easiest tool that gets the job done. And sometimes that's people, and the people don't have to be smart. And sometimes that's bots, and sometimes that's paid groups of influencers. And sometimes, they just try random stuff and see what happens. But yeah, there is something to using coordinated groups of people to do something. And it does carry a bit more nuance than most of the botnets that are out there, although in many cases not that much more.
Let's talk about role of other forms of media here, right? Because like social media in isolation is always kind of it's a bad idea to sort of try to separate that out. And I believe there is a direct cite in the book to say something along the lines of that News Corp rarely generates computational propaganda, but we regurgitate it. And as a proud Wall Street Journal reporter, I would love to get a sense of the way that, but it wasn't just the Journal, or it was News Corp, I believe. So there's other options. I'll try not to take offense, but like I would be curious about the relationship between sort of inauthentic activity and media coverage, and also whether there is any indication you see that people in my line of work have gotten smarter or more skeptical about things that are trending.
Yeah, look, I mean, there's whole disinformation beats at some papers now. There's lots of people that are actually working on these topics specifically, and then you have folks that are dedicated to working on specific coverage of specific companies like yourself and many other bright reporters. There is indeed, however, a cyclical connection between what we see happening on social media in terms of computational propaganda and the spread of that coverage among especially more partisan news outlets, very much partisan news outlets, folks like Breitbart on the right, or the Daily Caller. And then, sometimes on the left, unfortunately, folks like Huffington Post and Mother Jones. And, it's unfortunate across the board that they would look to social media as if it was a harbinger of like what was actually happening, because we kind of know that it's not. So, there is this feedback loop there, and journalists do play a role. Journalists are oftentimes the primary targets of manipulation campaigns. There's folks that have written about this quite convincingly, like Whitney Phillips, who's written about the oxygen of amplification and how white supremacists and extremists and these kinds of folks specifically target journalists in order to try to get them to launder information that comes from dubious sources in order to make it look good. And the journalists are doing this not in a malicious way, not purposefully, but because they think they're onto something and they themselves get gamed. It doesn't happen as much now, I would say, at the better, papers that have better, clear ethics guidelines, that have well-trained reporters and those sorts of things. But your average newspaper around the United States, even in some large cities, does not have that kind of capacity, and they just simply don't know a lot of the time that it's, well, unfortunately, sometimes they don't know that they shouldn't be posting tweets as if they were sources, for instance, and that's just basic.
It's very kind of you to say that only applies to small regional, misguided newspapers as opposed to pretty much everyone.
Well, it does apply. It does apply to everyone, but I will say that, the more, again, this is something I say in the book a lot of times. The more resources you have as an institution, and that includes training, the less manipulatable you are. But that's not necessarily true across the board, I will say.
A question about the future of some of this stuff. I would be remiss if I did not contemplate the idea that one might be able to use a generative AI system to be the nasty reply guy on posts at a very high rate of speed, and that perhaps the content would seem less spammy. So like, let's say if vaccine related things were in the news, that you might be able to have it say, great point, but look at these unexplained deaths, or something like that, which, it seems like it might be a harder thing to detect and also a more credible thing. And I would be curious, there's been a lot of hype about both ChatGPT and also the dangers thereof. And I'd be curious about your read as to like, if that's where we should expect to see that in the next 6 months, or if not so much, it's still going to be basic but powerful, given that platforms don't do enough.
We've been seeing some degree of this, machine learning or just learning AI, broadly speaking, being deployed for the purposes of propaganda for a couple of years now. But you have to kind of know the people who are deploying it to even catch it or understand that that's what's happening. So I've had people show me, like ways in which they're using machine learning in some of the bots that they use. But those folks, up until recently, have been few and far between because these products were expensive to run. They still are incredibly expensive to run. ChatGPT, for instance, someone was telling me it costs millions of dollars a day to run. But now they're becoming more ubiquitous, more publicly accessible. And so that does mean that we should be absolutely concerned about the ways in which all sorts of types of people might try to leverage these tools in order to create more sophisticated propaganda in a way that looks more legitimate, exactly like you were saying, like, hey, look at these legitimate scientific sources. Here's the facts, right? Like, any technology, most technologies, particularly media technologies, when they are first launched, are talked about as if they are the saviors of democracy. It happened with the newspaper, it happened with television. There's always this conversation as if like this tool is the new educational tool and it's going to make everyone so much smarter and it's going to help us to govern better. That happened with the internet. That happened with social media. And I think in some ways people have a conversation about how great ChatGPT is. Of course, they're going to talk about how it's used for cheating on term papers, whatever. But we should absolutely be asking questions about how ChatGPT and these kinds of tools will be manipulated, because they will. People will co-opt these tools for their own purposes, and particularly the powerful will co-opt them. And in many ways, suffice to say, these tools are already being used. So the social media companies have a big task on their hands. There's a reason why it's beneficial to get us to focus on very benign, clunky crypto bots, because the problem is so much more advanced now than that. It's come leaps and bounds.
Should we get to the Q&A? I believe there was a suggestion.
Sure. Yeah.
Is that how do we open that up?
I've been encouraging people to post, and I'm going to do that one more time. So folks, if you do have questions, now is the time. If you want to continue with this kind of train of conversations, for maybe one more question, just give them a chance to kind of generate some.
Sure, absolutely. So final question here would be, if you looked at this stuff in relation to January 6th, we were talking earlier today about some of the entities that organized it, and I was stating that Kylie Creamer, who was one of the women, the mother-daughter duo who put together the January 6th rally, was explaining that the Stop the Steal group that she'd formed was growing so fast it broke a lot of algorithms. And that struck me as not necessarily a technically correct view of algorithms. But I guess I'm curious. There, at the same time, though, there was also a real focus in some of the J6 committee report on inauthenticity and on sort of coordination. I'd be curious if there was if the computational element of that popped up in your work.
Yeah, there's been a lot of conversation about the role of platforms in January the 6th and who was doing what and how. I went and looked over some of the depositions of the folks that you're talking about. And one of the things that, you and I can both agree on is that these weren't the savviest actors out there, that they were using these tools in such a way that brought together a bunch of sundry people who had very anti-institutional beliefs and were able to gather and leverage these tools, oftentimes for like simple communication and for organization and for coordination. We can't say that Facebook, caused January 6th, but we can absolutely say without a shadow of a doubt that Facebook, its platform, that Meta's platform, WhatsApp, Telegram, many of these platforms played an integral role in communication and coordination about this stuff. Were there bots involved? There has been, yes, some bots involved in some of this. A lot of it was more human coordination, though. And we're actually starting to dig through some of the data sets on Jan 6, or we have been for the last year or so at my lab. And some of what we're finding is really, really interesting. I think that power players like influencers and these folks that have hundreds of thousands or millions of followers on Instagram, on other platforms, they are key nodes for how we have to understand how this stuff works today.
So I think we have a question from Susan Lippman just about the inevitability of this sort of thing happening on a revenue-driven platform, and I would be, I would be curious as to your read on that, and as to whether also this is something that is healthy or unhealthy for the platforms themselves.
Look, one of the biggest questions I've had in the back of my mind for the last 10 years is, to what extent does inauthentic content do inauthentic profiles on these platforms help their bottom line? So, how does it drive up advertising? How does it drive up user counts? One of Elon Musk's big complaints when he was trying to get out of buying Twitter was, we just can't really know how many bots there are on Twitter and how many real people there are, and to what extent does that affect the actual buying and selling of ads, which is the business of these companies, and to what extent are they kind of shells? Like, is this actually efficacious? Is it inevitable on these platforms that we have what we have? Under the current design, the way that they're designed now, the way that they're built, the way that they're built to optimize our attention and keep us on platform, and also to sell ads, it's pretty difficult to foresee that they would change significantly enough in their current format to become something that didn't allow this. We need new social media platforms. Like, these piecemeal overhauls of like certain small parts of the platforms are again, I feel, are misdirection. There are groups that are doing some really cool work in this space, but they've got a high hill to climb, because we're talking about very, very powerful companies. Even though they've lost some market share in the last 6 months, even, they're still incredibly powerful, and they still are able to edge out most other competition quite quickly.
Is this like, are they just going along for the ride, like in terms of the bot and the computational propaganda component of this? Is it something that's just like, we maximize growth and these guys just happen to be very good at taking advantage of it? Or do you actually see it as somewhat symbiotic? In other words, are any of these entities producing content and engagement that is, actually keeps people on the platform and entertained?
I do think there's certainly aspects of these platforms that keep people entertained. Like, people that I know and love really do like Instagram and TikTok, and they feel that they're a creative outlet for them in many ways. That being said, there is so much mindless scrolling, and sort of like, I find myself, this is anecdotal, but something that I find myself doing is constantly logging on to social media platforms when I did it 2 minutes ago, and I know nothing is going to have changed, despite the fact I study this stuff. And so there's something.
Also, you're having this conversation with me, so that's really rude, man.
Yeah. I mean, I'm on Twitter right now, but anyway, no. But so you can have benefits while also having negatives. It's just that I don't, after everything I've seen at these companies, especially in the last several months, but over the last few years, I don't think we're going to see very much change until it's regulated by the government. And I'm not a massive fan of the idea of regulating speech and media, but there has to be some kind of regulation, and it just hasn't happened. The other thing,
like more like rate limits and, I mean, things of that nature, right?
Yeah, much more of that, and much less, true, like any kind of censorship of speech and those kinds of things. I'm not a fan of that. Although there are things that you can do, right? Like you can prohibit people from posting content that disenfranchises people, that takes away their vote, or that misleads them about voting. We see a ton of that online still. You can also prohibit people from targeting marginalized communities with specific kinds of harassment in an amplified way. We see a ton of that. Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, all of these folks, they didn't acknowledge that computational propaganda existed until 2016, until they couldn't any longer continue to pretend that there wasn't a problem on the platform. They basically ignored it until that time. We gave them so much research. They knew this was happening. I honestly think that they're hoping that we forget. I think, and then Facebook and Meta's so-called move to end-to-end encryption across all platforms, if that's still going to happen, that seems like a patently obvious move towards getting people to not pay attention to what's happening behind closed doors.
There's a question about estimates of the cost. I think I would be interested in your sense of that, and also just estimates of the scale. I mean, to some degree, like, is there a way to at least tell what's coming through the back end as opposed to from a user at a keyboard, and how that what portion of content that is?
I mean, I think not really. The cost and the scale are unthinkably high in both of these cases. Like, I feel no compunction in saying that the cost of not just computational propaganda, but coordinated and authentic behavior on these platforms in all of its forms is certainly in the billions of dollars every year. And then also that, the scale of this stuff is, we're talking about thousands, millions of engagements every minute. And so it's almost impossible to count. And it's almost a non-starter even trying to estimate scale or sheer quantity, because none of us actually really have access to the ability to measure that. Not even on all the platforms, but let alone one platform. Because we're denied access. We don't have that access. Right. We rely upon them to give it to us, and they give it to us piecemeal.
Do you have a sense that if you did have that access, you could come up with reliable estimates in a fairly prompt fashion? Or Meta says that 5% of its accounts are fake. That's sort of reported. It's been that number for a long time. Do you have first of all, do you find that credible? And is your sense the people working on this stuff? I mean, you mentioned some of these people and that they recently were laid off, but do they have a sense of whether that is a reliable estimate, and what portion of activity of engagement is coming from non-people, shall we say?
So two things. I think one thing, in terms of my interviewees that have worked at these companies, and there's a lot of them, they've told me again and again that those numbers are low. They're purposefully low. The second thing is that oftentimes what they've also said is that they don't think that the companies truly know how much inauthentic behavior there is on their platforms, that they've scaled so fast, particularly in the case of Facebook, but also WhatsApp and YouTube. They've scaled so fast, and they did not build in the fail safes that we're saying are needed early on. They're trying to do it after the fact. And so that there's so much traffic on these sites that it's just by its sheer amount untrackable, even through sophisticated AI mechanisms, and even those get things wrong quite a lot of the time. If I had access to the Twitter fire hose, and I've worked on research teams that have, would I be able to do more
Oh,
efficient.
not that. I'm talking about also metadata, IPE.
Oh yeah.
Every because Firehose just gives you all the tweets, and I don't know that helps you that much, but
Yeah. We could do so much just at my team, but researchers around the world who work on this stuff just at universities could, I would think, very quickly come together to do a lot more than we've seen happen within the companies, because even the researchers that I respect in these companies and that I've liked, many of whom, as I've mentioned, have been fired, even those folks are product focused. So they are still working on teams that tend to push them towards optimization of a product. They're not working on research for the sake of research. They're not doing the kind of work that we're talking about here. And so I'm hopeful that there is a lot of possibility there. I do think that the social media platforms are quite worried about that day happening, because it would functionally mean that they've lied to the Securities and Exchange Commission for years and years and years about the number of fake profiles on the platforms.
I mean, there are the privacy issues are obviously also significant for external data, but I wouldn't argue that privacy is the only reason why that information hasn't been made public.
That's so true. I mean, and that is a trump card that's often played, but I don't think that's an insurmountable challenge, particularly if you figure out controlled ways of allowing vetted third-party researchers access to the content. Especially on a site, on sites that are more publicly facing off. Of course, I would never ask for that on WhatsApp or Signal or some such, because they couldn't give it and it wouldn't be ethical.
Does anybody else have a final question? I have one more I'm going to ask right now, which is toward the end of the book, there is a reference to, and obviously your sources are unnamed because most people don't wish to be known for their violations of terms of service. There's a source who you describe as sort of really distinguishing himself as basically having his own, as sort of being an aspiring pundit who had his own army.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious about what made that person different than the others, and also what he hoped to get out of it. Because I think, and the point of exactly of how does that, lead to fame and fortune in your mind?
This person that you're talking about was a diehard political junkie, and also a former software engineer, and lives in the middle of the United States and spends basically all of his time online. And if you go to this person's house, which you probably never will, obviously, you would be blown away by the amount of technological capacity he has in his house. We're talking about running multiple computers, at a given time, access to things that it's not even worth going into. So on the one hand, this person spends all his time online. He's connected all the time. And so he is a power user on social media. On the other hand, he has the know-how to amplify his own voice. And I think that for him, he thought that the coolest thing he could possibly do was become a trusted voice in the political ecosystem that he was most interested in. And that was his dream. And he's achieved it in many ways. I haven't looked at his profile online on various social media for a while, but last time I had looked, he had millions of followers and was retweeted by ex-presidents and other folks like that. So
impressive. I mean, doesn't he know that the way you get millions of followers is that you steal content from YouTube and then viral content from YouTube and then just post it shamelessly over and over? But I mean, this gets back to the question of the overlap between what you can do with computational propaganda and what a platform assists with that. Final question here was, according to your new book, social media platforms are encoded with a variety of bias. This is a good question, because I was actually planning on asking about this. Those affect user behaviors. As a result of that, most of the studies based on the data from social media must be unreliable because the data are contaminated by encoded bias and most studies ignore its effects. I've never read the paper of quantitative analysis to this field that mentioned encoded bias in social media platforms. And I would be curious what you have to say about that, and then I might want to close that out by arguing with it. But let's
look, like there's bias coded in at the software at the code level. You have Meredith Broussard's forthcoming book, More Than a Glitch, that talks about this. You have Safia Noble's book, both amazing books talking about this bias. As an ethnographic researcher, I focus so much upon people and the ways in which the motivations people have in doing the work that they do. And so these are human-oriented stories. I've long been skeptical of a lot of the quantitative research out there, particularly on Twitter, because of this exact fear. You know, a trump card that you can still play to this day at any conference where you see an academic presenting quantitative data on Twitter is to say, well, do you know how many bots were in that sample? Like, you know, like you're making some really big claims. Do you know how many bots were in the sample? And the answer is usually no, I didn't think about that. I'll let you know in the next paper.
No, they won't.
No, they won't. No, they won't. And so, yeah, you know, there are some issues there, but there's always issues with data in science, right? Like there, you know, and data cleaning is a whole business. There's people that professionalize in this. And so we've gotten quite good at cleaning data. Does that mean that there's still not racism encoded into algorithms and those sorts of things? No. But does it mean that we think we can say substantive things with the data? Yes. Can we talk about first order effects? Like, can we say that Russian propaganda on Twitter caused Trump to win the 2016 election? No, that's not how the internet works. We can talk about second, third order effects. People like Kate Starbird and other researchers have talked about this to a great degree. And so, you know, like we just have to rethink the arguments that we make leveraging social media data. We don't need to try to solve, you know, dividing zero. Like we can do other things.
I don't think I need to argue with that then. No, it's just the bias element that it seems like is always assumed is like that, you know, the Democrats are secretly sneaking in Democratic code. And you know, I guess I've just never seen indications of them doing so effectively if they even tried, which generally they didn't. So actually we have one more question from Robert, which is whether your book discusses content moderation as a form of influencing consensus by removing factual information from view.
Yeah, you know, and that kind of touches on what you were just talking about. Like, do people with particular partisan perspectives or speech-oriented perspectives or censorship-oriented perspectives affect what shows up on the platforms? Content moderation is a messy space, and you know, people like Carlton Gillespie have written about this. Sarah Roberts very effectively talking about the custodians of the internet. I would point you to their work. What I would say is, yeah, there are circumstances in which bad decisions get made and content gets moderated. But the thing I was going to say in response to what Jeff said is that the people that work at these platforms are so scared, so terrified of being accused of being partisan, and they have been for a very, very long time, that they almost oftentimes overcompensate and take way too long to make decisions about things than actually acting without thought. I think the exact, in my experience with these companies, the exact opposite is true, that they overthink things or that they just never act.
Yeah, I've always, the idea that suppressing the New York Post Hunter Biden story was in some ways a triumph of censorship is always a very funny concept to me, given that literally that got the thing 100 times more attention than it would have ever earned. You have, I don't think you need to address this one to me, but you have a call for a particular paper about Midori, the PR agent in Japan. So, you know, write another book, damn it.
I'll work on that. Thanks for letting me know.
Okay, well,
you could slip it in your book, actually. Why don't you do that?
Yeah. Oh no. I'm the computational propaganda stuff is is difficult. I'm kind of more on the, I mean, you cross into it, the system design elements, but yeah, they're obviously intertwined. So
Indeed. Well, thank you.
We're at the top of the hour, and I really want to thank both of you for a very stimulating, thought-provoking, at some levels kind of chilling evening.
Oh, we're screwed. We're screwed. Yeah.
A lot to think about.
Yeah, Sam's book actually does have a conclusion in terms of what the solution and way forward is on this. And it's a little less convincing than the rest of the book, but there are some good ideas there.
I really had to dig deep for that. Look at groups like New Public are doing really cool work on this. New Public, everyone, look at them up.
Yeah.
No endorsements on this end. All right.
Thank you
thanks.
both, man. I really appreciate it. I want to send a big shout out to Caitlin Gallagher and Jennifer Doerr at Yale University Press for all their efforts in actually making tonight a reality. Last but not least, thanks to all of you for joining us from around the country and also around the world. I posted links, of course, from which you may purchase books. If you're in the hood, please come on down and pay us a visit. We're located in San Francisco's historic North Beach district. We're open 7 days a week, Monday through Thursday, 11 to 8, and then back to pre-pandemic hours almost on Friday through Saturday, 11 to 9. Tonight's event has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, continuing the legacy of our founder, the late Lawrence Ferlinghetti, through public events like this one, a publishing program, and educational outreach, all dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. So take care, everyone. We hope to see you all again soon.
And big congrats to City Lights for winning the Toni Morrison Award today.
Okay.
Well deserved. All right, y'all. Take care.